Welcome back to the next lecture. And in this lecture and the other lecture for this week, we're going to be looking at different aspects of food: ideology, symbolism, and power. Maybe you're laying there late at night and you might think to yourself, what does it all mean? What is it all about? And in terms of food, we might write that off, like we eat simply to survive, right? But how can we understand food as more than just nutrients? Food as an entire system, a system of ideology, symbolism, and power. Now, I'm not going to get into the readings too much. I'm going to give you an example that overlaps with the readings, because you can do the readings yourself and you can summarize that and you can pick out what is important in that and how that relates to nutritional anthropology. But before we get into the example I want to give you, let's define a few terms. What is ideology? I mean, you hear these terms and some of you will be able to define them, but some of us only have a colloquial understanding. So, ideology in light of nutritional anthropology is a set of explicit beliefs and values that are articulated by social, political, religious groups. All human activities and experiences related to food. So we're not just talking about one small thing, but the broad spectrum of ideological influences. For example, fast food culture. That is a cultural component, right? An aspect of ideology, of food and nutrition, and what it means within a particular social construct. Next is symbolism. And symbolism is basically a refined form of ideology. It is looking at one particular ideological feature. Food is something that can stand for or suggest something else as a function of a relationship or association or convention or resemblance. And we've kind of touched on that already. That food is not just what tastes good or what tastes bad, right? Because those are judgments within a construct. And if you remember back towards the beginning of the term, I know it's already week 6, but we don't just eat glucose, right? We eat food. And we don't just eat amino acids. We eat food. And many people don't eat food simply because of the nutrients. We eat certain foods, or we don't eat certain foods because of all the meanings and the symbolism that go along with food. I mean, we touched on that a bit with food taboos. And last, social power. And that is exactly what it sounds like, of course. Power. An individual or a group of individuals exerting authority over other individuals or groups, including control of access to resources, distribution of resources, autonomy, independence, free will, etc. Combining all of those aspects together, we get the foods that we eat. But those foods don't just exist in a vacuum, just like you don't exist in a vacuum. You grow up in a culture. You grow up in a system. Your food exists within that same system. Food is a reflection of identity, of who we are or who we think we are. And it's not just associating certain foods with certain cultures, but the meaning of food or the meaning with food. If I say, think of male foods or think of female foods, do certain images come to your mind? If I say, think of children foods or kid foods, and think of adult foods, or rich versus poor foods, or a food that you would associate with Democrats or Republicans, or independents, or Green Party candidates, or foods that you eat compared to foods that your neighbor eats, right? You have images of these things. But why? Because you are a part of not just one, but many different contexts, groups, units, families, tribes. And each of these groupings has ideas about food, has limits on what is food, on what is acceptable to eat. We've already looked at that with food taboos, for example. But beyond that, how food is even obtained and prepared and served and consumed. And you can probably relate to this as well. I mean, I'm sure you have gone to a house of one of your friends or a family member, and they cook things differently. They eat things differently. It might be more formal or less formal. It might be more or less organized. The point is that food is just as much about social and ecological contexts as it is about the nutritional constitutes of food. Now, I have a lot of examples that I would love to give you, but I don't want to exhaust you. So here are just a few more basic examples. Think about Thanksgiving. What is Thanksgiving to you? And think about that for a bit. You can pause this and write down some ideas. What Thanksgiving means. And you might relate this to history, U.S. history. You might relate this to turkey, to family, to eating together a meal, a large meal, or maybe certain kinds of foods like mashed potatoes or rolls or yams or cranberries. Giving thanks, right? On your list, you might have ham. You might have chicken. You might have beef. You might even have pizza. But I'm guessing that's probably not the case, right? What just happened there? Well, we've taken food and ideology and we've smashed them together, right, to create symbolism. Thanksgiving is about food, but it's also about family and history and giving thanks and all those other things coming together, helping out. But that symbolism is fairly rigid because you wouldn't necessarily associate pizza with Thanksgiving, right? And you can do this with other aspects of our culture. For example, who is at that Thanksgiving meal and how is that served? Is it at a table with family and friends? Do you have a plate? Do you have all of the food that is being served on serving plates or trays? And do you take some of that food from a serving plate or tray and put it on your own plate, right? Or would you, for example, reach over to your neighbor's plate and give them food, or not? Can you reach over to your neighbor's plate and start eating off of their plate? How many of us would eat Thanksgiving meals with a fork, spoon, and knife, or with chopsticks, or with fingers? How many of us would not have an individual plate, but would think of Thanksgiving or this kind of a meal in terms of eating off of a large communal plate for the whole family or for the whole group? Right? The point is that there are many different ways of looking at this. There is no one right way, but we tend to think that there is because we grow up in this cultural construct. There are many different cultures around the world where eating off of a communal plate is acceptable and normal, for example. And that brings me to the example that I want to give you and expand on a bit. The information on the screen reflects information that we've already gone over to some extent. Humans are primates. We looked briefly at our early history as hunters and gatherers. Well, as gatherers and then later on as scavengers and then later on as hunters. But we have this long history as foraging animals, I mean, for millions of years. Up until only about 10 to 15,000 years ago, where we have a very short history as a settled primate with a secure food supply as a result of domestication and agriculture. Comparing millions of years to the last 10,000 to 15,000 years, we are better adapted to that ancestral type of life and environment compared to the more contemporary environment. In that ancestral environment, securing food for survival was necessary. It was part of the daily challenge, right? If you did not secure food, that was a matter of life and death. You had to search for food, and that means that you have to use energy. You put yourself at a risk of predation, for example. There are challenges that you had to face, not just in finding food, but in finding the perfect foods, because the world isn't full of fresh fruit and edible plants. It's not like every vegetable out there is edible. There are toxic plants. There are animals that are predators and animals that have infectious diseases. And there are foods that are edible but that are not nutritionally dense, right? That don't necessarily give you the nutrients that your body needs. So finding foods and finding all the foods that you need to survive is a task. And there are costs for mistakes, high costs. How do we know what to eat? Well, whether you're talking about the ancestral environment or more of a contemporary environment, food knowledge and food choice is based on learning, culture. And as a part of that, food becomes culture. It can become a tool, allowing people to make social distinctions or to establish social connections. For example, by sharing food, which we just talked about in the last couple of slides. How does that relate to our contemporary developed environment here in the US? And this doesn't relate to everybody in the US, but looking at a large portion of the population. There is a surplus of food, meaning that food is easy to access, and it doesn't require any significant energy to find it and secure it. There is an enormous variety of food, and variety sort of lends itself to an increased intake of food because people tend to like to try novel foods from time to time. And our technology has developed sort of a superfood, something like dessert or chocolate. And that is very appealing to people. And it's also very energy dense, right? High fat content. All of these things are different from the ancestral environment that we are adapted to, which is the point I'm trying to make there. In addition to that, we live in this society that hasn't really compensated for advances in food and nutritional understanding. And what I mean by that is that there are hundreds of studies that present hundreds of findings on the links between dietary practices and diseases like heart disease or cancer. But people don't know what to do with all that information. I mean, you can even find one study that would say coffee is bad and another study that says coffee is good. I mean, that's not really the take-home message. That's what we get filtered down to us, but that coffee can have benefits or coffee can have negative consequences. I mean, what do we make of this? And this may not apply to you, but to our culture at large, right? That there is little to no education about nutrition and about balancing risks with benefits, about basic probability, and about the nature of science. So what do people do if they don't understand risks and amounts and systems? Well, they classify very rudimentary, good or bad, good food, bad food. As an example, over 30% of Americans think that fat or salt in your diet is bad. Now, you know that that is not the case, that we actually need lipids, that we need salt, And a fat-free or a salt-free diet is not necessarily a healthy diet. Or people will tend to think that ice cream is bad, that any ice cream is bad. So they might eat a pint of cottage cheese instead of a tablespoon of ice cream. And in doing so, end up eating significantly more saturated fats. And science, anyway, is often misunderstood. One study does not make a fact. Just because you read one study on the harm of coffee, for example, doesn't mean that coffee is bad. You didn't prove that with the study. You only support a hypothesis, right? We need a lot more studies that support a hypothesis before we can begin to think of something as a theory or as a fact. Part of what all of this has led to is an obesogenic environment here. Food is easy, and on the other side, food is confusing. It's accessible, but all these studies are conflicting or confusing. So people tend to make uninformed choices or poor choices or to overeat. And that can lead to being overweight or obese. An obesogenic environment is all of those factors of social and cultural environments that promote and permit overeating and obesity. And what you have is an emphasis on quantity. Here in the US Americans tend to like quantity. Okay, that's one culture and the meaning of food in one culture, or aspects of the meaning of food. Using that cross-cultural perspective, let's look at the meaning of food somewhere else. And in this particular example, in France. Now, the stereotype of French people here tends to be that they are healthy, that they enjoy food, and they are healthy, and people there do enjoy food. But the U.S. stereotype of French culture, it tends to be that they might enjoy food too much, right? More than us here. And that somehow food or the enjoyment of food is perverse. But you may or may not be surprised to know that the French tend to live longer on average than the United States Americans. In fact, as you can see in a table here, not only do the French live longer, but so do people in 28 other countries. And you might think that you can easily relate this to diet and write it off, but in most of those countries, like France for example, people regularly consume animal fats or foods high in cholesterol. Still, in France, cardiovascular disease is 30% lower than in the US, despite the fact that blood serum cholesterol levels are around 50 milligrams higher, which is nearly 25% higher than people here in the US. So, it appears that they eat bad foods but live longer. How is that the case? Well, in addition to that, French people are on average thinner than US Americans. How can we explain that? Well, we have to look beyond simple nutrition. We have to look at other aspects of food, the meaning behind food. In France, compared to people here in the US, in France people express less stress and more pleasure in relation to eating. And this is partly because people are focusing more on the experience and the culture and the symbolism of eating in France, compared to here in the US, where people focus more on consequences, which is also a form of symbolism, but on the consequences of eating. In France, they also people express that food is more important to life and as a part of everyday life than here in the US. The focus for people in France is on the quality of food, not on the quantity of food. And this was illustrated in a number of studies in which they surveyed people. If given a choice between a luxury hotel with average food, or a pretty low-end hotel with 5-star gourmet food. Nearly all of the U.S. Americans surveyed said that they would choose the luxury hotel because that was luxury, right? The food wasn't really a component, but it was almost the inverse result in France, where nearly all of the French citizens said that they would choose the low-end hotel with the gourmet food. Also, if given a choice between a fine dining experience with only one food choice, it's what the chef was cooking, and you didn't get to modify that or change that, what we tend to do in our society. We like things the way we want them. So a choice between that fine dining experience with one food choice or a basic dining experience with a variety of choices. Well, most of the French, 95%, chose that fine dining experience option. But most Americans chose the variety option. And keep that environmental context in mind, because this is all happening within an environment, right? First of all, snacking. Snacking is relatively rare in France, and food between meals is not common, as opposed to here in the US, where people will snack regularly. You might even be snacking while you're listening to me talk, and meals between meals is more common. Also, fast food. It's not like that fast food culture is everywhere, but you do have fast food restaurants in France, like McDonald's, for example. And people will go there to eat. I mean, that's fast food, but you can look at this from a different context. The average eating time for someone in McDonald's in France is about 30 minutes. But in the US, it's nearly half that time, almost 15 minutes. So we eat faster compared to someone in France. And if we get out of that fast food context and look at maybe like a home-cooked meal or a meal where you're sitting down with family and friends. In France, that's a more regular thing. And those meals can last for hours, every day. But in the US, that might only occur, a meal that lasts for several hours might only occur during special events or holidays, right? And remembering all the way back to week 2 and 3, which I know you probably don't, but we talked briefly about what happens when you put large amounts of food in front of people. Well, they tend to eat it. In France, the serving or portion sizes are about 50% smaller than here in the US. And this isn't just for a meal in a restaurant, although it's also the case, but for the food that you buy in stores, like packaged food, like potato chips, for example. If you add up all that small exercise, you can account for 8 pounds of weight gain in 1 year, difference between the US and France. And there you have it, comparing two different cultures, looking at ideology, symbolism, the environments, and the meanings behind food. And it adds up to these differences, quality and pleasure versus quantity and convenience, and how that impacts the body, and how that reflects other layers and textures of a culture. Now, on that table I've got on the slide that just talks about some of the things that we touched on already in the last 10 slides or so. So you can take those and you can explore those in more depth in something like a quiz question, for example. And we'll stop there for this lecture. Now, I didn't get into any of the chapters that you're going to read for symbolism, ideology, and power. I'm going to challenge you to read those and pull out the main points yourself. Again, just a review preview for this week and next week. This week we have the 2 lectures, Ideology, Symbolism, and Power of Foodways, and Adapting Food to People and People to Foods. and you can go ahead and watch that or listen to that next lecture whenever you're ready. Those are based off of our reading, so a number of readings in our book this week. And there's no graded assignment this week, but keep making progress on your final project. I'll make your second progress paper link available this week, and you can submit that early and be done with that, because it's due next week anyway. And that's, again, not really a paper, it's just an outline of your final project. And next week we're going to be looking at foods as medicine and under nutrition, a number of readings in our book. And we might have another documentary, our last documentary. I'm not quite sure on that yet, but in any case, we've got the readings and the lectures. You've got your second progress paper due next week and our third quiz. See you next lecture.